Rassie Erasmus stood in front of the cameras at Ellis Park and said he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. For a coach who treats every public word like a chess move, that admission alone told you something extraordinary had just happened. His Springboks had put 45 points on England, scored 7 tries to 3, and done it while missing 2 of the most experienced leaders in the entire squad. Siya Kolisi and Eben Etzebeth were both scratched before kickoff, not injured mid-game, not withdrawn at halftime, but ruled out in the hours before the match even started. England knew it. They walked out at altitude against a South African side already down its captain and one of its most feared locks, and it still didn't matter. The scoreboard read 45-21, and the manner of the beating was almost more damaging than the margin. The opening quarter set the tone for everything that followed. Thomas du Toit went over first, then Cheslin Kolbe, then Kurtley Arendse, and inside 13 minutes, South Africa had racked up 17 unanswered points. Steve Borthwick's side had spent the entire build-up talking about a fresh chapter, about shaking off a difficult Six Nations and proving they belonged among the genuine heavyweights of the sport. Instead, that narrative was torn up before most fans had settled into their seats. Jamie George, filling in as captain with Kolisi missing on the other side of the ledger too, later admitted the toughest part wasn't the concession of points, but the trap his side fell into once they were behind. He spoke about the difficulty of escaping a cycle once South Africa have dragged you into playing on their terms, of conceding a penalty, watching the Springboks camp inside your own half, and then struggling to find a way back out of that pressure. England gave away field position through ill discipline, and against this South African pack, that is close to a fatal mistake. What made the story so much harder for England to process was the composition of the South African team that inflicted the damage. With Kolisi and Etzebeth unavailable, Erasmus had to hand a debut to O. de Villiers and trust Cameron Hanekom in a specialist position with only a single cap to his name. Peter Steph du Toit, one of the most decorated forwards in world rugby, was shifted out of his usual home and into the second row simply to hold the pack together. 2 raw names and 1 experienced player repositioned out of pure necessity, and South Africa still walked away by 24 points. That is not a side papering over gaps with individual brilliance. It's a structure so deeply embedded that even the least experienced players in the group can step into the fire and still function at a level good enough to dismantle a Tier 1 nation. Du Toit put it best himself. He talked about a system set in stone, one where if a player buys in and understands it fully, the system in turn takes care of that player. It's a simple line, but it says everything about how Erasmus has built this group. There's no reliance on 2 or 3 stars to drag everyone else through a test match. The environment is designed so that a one-cap forward or a debutante can be trusted with responsibility on the biggest stage without the whole operation falling apart. That's years of coaching philosophy showing up in real time, under real pressure, against a genuine test nation and altitude, with the pack rebuilt on the fly. Damien Dialende, shifted into the centers for the day, added another layer when he reflected on the match afterward. He called it a challenging test, which on the surface reads as understated given the final score, but the context mattered more than the phrase itself. South Africa had anticipated an England fightback and viewed the response to it as something to be admired rather than survived. There was no relief in his tone, no sense that the result had been in doubt, just an acknowledgement that the pressure applied by England in the second half had been expected and handled within the framework of the game plan. When your own center talks about the opposition's comeback like a checkpoint rather than a genuine threat, it tells you how far ahead of the contest this South African side was thinking before a ball had even been kicked. Erasmus, for his part, downplayed the whole performance as above average. Those were his words, delivered after a 7-try haul against a Tier 1 opponent, missing 2 senior leaders before kickoff. It takes a rare kind of confidence to describe a 24-point demolition that way, and it says as much about where this Springbok group currently sits as any statistic from the match itself. His post-match concerns were reportedly more focused on the fitness of his front row than on anything resembling doubt about the performance. That's a coach managing fine details, not someone still trying to prove a point. On the other side of the story, the mood in the English media turned dark almost immediately. Former England fly-half Paul Grayson didn't hold back on BBC Sports, describing an England attack that never found any rhythm across the full 80 minutes, fragmented and unable to build pressure against a defense that refused to give an inch. He warned that South Africa's direct, relentless approach had drained England physically well before the closing stages, leaving nothing in reserve. His phrase about ominous clouds gathering over this England side spread quickly across social media, and it's not hard to see why it landed the way it did. The Telegraph framed the result as a fifth consecutive Test defeat, a run that's difficult to explain away as a one-off. There was no version of the promised reset visible in that performance, and the gap between what had been promoted before the tour and what actually happened on the pitch has become the central storyline of England's week. Perhaps the most uncomfortable moment of the entire evening came in the second half when Henry Arundel was introduced as England trailed 31-19. Arundel, one of the young players supposed to represent the attacking future of this England side, was met with audible boos from a section of the traveling support. These are supporters who paid to follow their team to South Africa, and by the 58th minute they had already turned on one of their own. That's not frustration over a missed kick or a refereeing call. That's a fan base that had run out of patience while the game was still being played in front of them. George, speaking afterward, praised the character shown by his players in clawing their way back into contention after being 17-0 down inside 12 minutes, and there was genuine substance to that fight. England scored 3 tries of their own and had another disallowed, closing the gap to within striking distance before South Africa pulled clear again in the closing stages. But the story of the night was always going to be written by those opening minutes and the manner in which South Africa dealt with the response that followed. England now turned to Fiji and Liverpool, and then a trip to Argentina, needing to find answers quickly. South Africa, missing 2 of their leaders and blooding new faces under the brightest lights available, simply confirmed what many suspected before the tournament even began. The gap between them and the rest remained significant, and it may be growing rather